At the Nocturnists, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
Support for the Nocturnists comes from the California Medical Association and the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. Learning medicine is tough. It requires a lot of reading, understanding, memorizing. But there are other parts of medicine that we learn differently, a more body-based learning, which is grounded in feel, in instinct, in spidey senses. How do we think about that type of learning? You're listening to The Nocturnists, stories from the world of medicine. I'm Emily Silverman. Today, I speak with Natasha Spottiswoode, an infectious disease physician scientist with a love of outdoor adventure. She grew up in California, studied malaria and iron metabolism in the UK, and moved to New York for medical school before coming back to UCSF for residency and now infectious disease fellowship. Outside of work, she loves to rock climb, backpack, cook new recipes, and explore new places with her partner and friends. Before I speak with Natasha, we're going to hear the story that she told live at the Nocturnists in January 2020. Here's Natasha.
It was a dark and stormy night. I actually don't mean that literally. This is San Francisco. It's beautiful weather, usually. But that night, it was clinically dark and stormy. I was brand new to being a senior resident. My intern was new to being an intern. And I think even my third-year medical student was also new to being a third-year medical student. And we were in the middle of the busiest call day that we had ever had. We'd taken so many patients, and they were all so sick. And I was super worried about being a senior resident and doing my job well and keeping the patients safe, but also giving everyone on the team the independence that they needed to grow. And I didn't know them very well. I knew my intern, George, well enough to know that I could trust him to take a thorough and sensitive history and to see patients as people and not just collections of illnesses. But I didn't know how good his clinical acumen was, and I worried that in our newness, we might miss the forest for the trees. So that night, we got a call from the emergency room that they had an admit for us, who was a gentleman with alcohol use disorder who'd been found down. And then we hear that he has a low hemoglobin, which is bad. And then we hear that he has a fast heart rate, which is much worse. And in that context, suggested that he was bleeding somewhere. So as we're walking to the ER to get this patient, I said to George, "What's the first thing we're going to look at when we go into the room?" And he says, "Well, this man has drunk a lot of alcohol over many years. I'm worried about his brain and his memory. We should know if he knows where we are and what year it is." And I said, "Yes, George, that's right. We will do that. But I'm really worried he's bleeding. So the first thing we're going to look at is how many IVs he has in case we have to give him blood." So we get to the room, and the patient does indeed look quite sick. And I said, "Actually, I'll take this patient. You'll take the next one." So I got to work, and my pager was going off. And the next thing I know, we have a second patient. And the second patient has metastatic cancer and is coming in confused. And I remember hearing that and thinking, this person is sick and I don't quite know why, and that's scary. But I couldn't leave the first patient, so I said, "George, can you go take a history, find out what's happening, and if they look bad or their vital signs change, just call me and I'll be there." So he goes off, and I go back to work on my first patient, and I was trying to keep track of everything that was happening that day, and I was thinking about someone's insulin level and an anion gap and a heart rate, and things were just stacking, and my pager kept going off. And somewhere in the emergency room, somebody was just screaming this long, unconnected string of expletives, and it didn't help. And at some point, I was talking to the emergency room doctors, and I was kind of worked up and gesticulating, and I knocked my coffee over, and it went all over my medical student. So then I had to stop for like at least 2 minutes and apologize, because I was now the resident who had thrown coffee on a medical student, no matter how accidental. And eventually I got that cleaned up, and I got my patient sorted out, and I sent him to the ICU, and I could think, and I could breathe. And as soon as I could, I went to go and see George, my intern. And so I get to the room where he is and the patient with the metastatic cancer and confusion. And from the door, I saw two things. Firstly, I saw George taking a meticulous and comprehensive and thoughtful history, asking the patient who they are and where they lived outside the hospital and how many children. And I also saw that his pager was going off as mine had been, and that he was triaging, that he'd look down, see what it said, look at the patient, look down, look at the patient. And then also, from my bird's eye view in the doorway, I saw the numbers on the screen. I saw the blood pressure lowering and the heart rate going higher. And I just remember taking that moment and breaking it and saying, stop everything, this is unstable. And then I took control, and I did all the things that you do to stabilize someone who's in septic shock, the fluids and the blood cultures and the lactate and the antibiotics. And I called the ICU again. And then when the urgency was done, I looked at George, who looked horrified because he knew what he'd missed, that this person was decompensating, and in the busyness, he hadn't seen it. And I felt terrible because I was so worried that in our collective busyness and the chaos of that night, and our collective inexperience, that perhaps we had not been fast enough. And also, I had done exactly what I shouldn't have done and just taken control of the situation instead of talking through it. And I was kind of thinking about what to say and trying to put a name to what it is that a new intern didn't yet have, but was going to learn. And the word I kept coming up with was airmanship, which is a very old concept from a very different part of my life. Before I was a doctor here in San Francisco, I used to be an amateur pilot in England. I didn't know I wanted to be a doctor when I was a kid. I actually thought I wanted to be a pilot or an astronaut or Amelia Earhart, except less dead. And then I got the chance to go to graduate school at the University of Oxford, and I found out that they had a flying team. So of course I joined. And I called up my parents and I said, I'm at Oxford, I have a robe and I wear it to dinner, and I'm learning how to fly. I think I'm actually at Hogwarts. It's pretty great. And the things I was learning how to fly are called gliders, and they're little planes without motors. And as you can imagine, they're actually kind of harder than planes with motors, which are sort of 3D cars. For example, for a glider to go up, you have to find a thermal, a column of rising air, and circle for height. If you've ever seen like a hawk or a big bird of prey doing that, it's the same thing. And I really quickly found that I was actually bad at it. I could do the book learning, I could learn the principles, but I had no innate sense for how a plane should move. And I couldn't plan ahead, and I couldn't anticipate dangers, and I really, really couldn't do landings. Like, could not stick landings, just couldn't get it right. And I watched all these people who had started with me, like, go on and get their solo licenses and like take part in competitions, and I was just stuck. And the pilots didn't make this super easy on me. We learned to fly on old planes, and the pilots who taught us were as old and as cantankerous as the planes themselves. And the one I flew with most, his name was Fred, and he was among the oldest and most cantankerous of the bunch. His thing was to hang out at the clubhouse between flights and eat these filthy sandwiches like fried bread, butter, bacon, eggs, butter, and fried bread. He looked as though at any moment he might have a heart attack, and he sometimes made jokes about women on the airfield that didn't quite land. But I knew that every time he got into the plane with me, he was quite literally putting his life in my really inexperienced hands. The thing about gliders is that they're dual control, but there is no override. So if the junior pilot, that's me, screws up, you both crash. And so for that reason, they teach us a command before we ever leave the ground that we must always obey. And the command is, I have control. And what it means is that I, as the junior pilot, should take my hands off the stick and my feet off the rudders and do nothing until the senior pilot sorts it out. And so I'd be practicing a landing and going in, and I'd hear, Spottiswoode, I have control. Or going for a stall, too slow, I have control. I hated it. And there came a day that I was flying with Fred, and he was really putting me through my paces. We'd done stalls, and we'd done spins, and we'd done a loop. And finally, we were going in for the end, which was a landing, and this time I was going to get it right. And I remember I was thinking about so many things. The wind was kind of gusty, and I was compensating for it. And I was keeping the nose down, and I was keeping the speed on, and I was adjusting the trim, and I was going in, and it was going to work. And then I heard, Spottiswoode, I have control. And I thought, what? But I took my hands off the stick and my feet off the rudders as I'd been taught, and I watched in dawning horror as Fred steered us out of the way of a tree. I had been about to hit a tree. And we landed, and I was sitting there, and I remember thinking, I'm going to be yelled at. And then I thought, I deserve to be yelled at. And then I thought, what am I doing? I just put 2 people at risk. I'm bad at this. I've never been good. I have no business here. And we get out of the plane, and he lights up one of his filthy cigarettes. And then, instead of yelling, he said, what do you think happened? And I said, I don't know. I just did not see it. And he said, I know. That's why there are 2 of us in this cockpit. Take half an hour, and we'll try again. So then there I am in the hospital, looking at my intern, who in his newness has missed something which is, in its way, as deadly as a tree. And I said, what do you think happened? And he said, I don't know. I didn't realize how sick they were. And I said, I know. It's going to be okay. They're going to be okay. We'll take this, we'll learn from it, and we'll do better next time. In case you're wondering, I did eventually get my license. I did eventually learn to fly. And on one of my first solo flights, I found one of those thermals I told you about, and I was flying in it, circling for height, and I happened to look out the window, and I saw a hawk, a big hawk, and it was just circling right along with me, and the 2 of us were just sharing the air.
So I am sitting here with Natasha Spottiswoode. Thanks for coming into the studio today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
You told this story in January 2020, which is now a couple years ago. How does it feel to reflect back on that night, on that performance? Pre-COVID, pre-chaos?
It's funny that you say that, because my first thought listening again to my performance was, wow, that was a long time ago. A lot has gone down.
That's what everybody says. And you became an infectious disease fellow during a pandemic. So tell us about that.
I did. I was a internal medicine doctor during, I'd say, most of COVID. And then in July of 2021, transitioned to being an infectious disease fellow, which is my current job. In terms of how that fed into my life decisions and path, I think I'd always had this worry that academic medicine was very far away from the lived experiences of patients. And then suddenly it was so viscerally front and center in all of our lives. And it reinforced the idea that this was something which really, really could matter.
So listening back to the story, other than reflecting on how much time has passed, did you see the story differently at all? Did it change, or did it feel like it rang true just as much as it did the night of?
I guess one thing that came up was, I think a lot of the story is about the idea of not being good at things and being new and being scared. And I think that the year of the pandemic was a time where we were all kind of new and scared and didn't really have a playbook for it. And so it felt very familiar to me, not just because, of course, I lived that story, but also because I feel like I kept experiencing it. And I was reflecting that maybe in some ways it was helpful to have had a lot of experience at being bad and persevering at hard, sometimes scary things. And maybe in a way that was good practice for me.
In the story, you use this word airmanship, which I love. And you go into it a bit in the story. What is airmanship? How does it work? But I was wondering if you could expand on that a bit. How do you think about airmanship? And I'm curious, after what you just said around COVID, how did airmanship play into the pandemic, if at all, for you and your colleagues?
Well, I think the idea of airmanship, as used in the piece, is the gut feel sense of a situation and what is going on and what should be going on. And I'd call that the part of medicine that you don't learn from memorizing books, which is super important too. So in terms of the last year in the pandemic, I'd say that it was an experience for me of no one having that at first, because none of us had done that. It was all new. And I think the closest I got to someone having really had that was a lot of the older docs who had worked during the 80s and experienced a really different pandemic, but one that was also marked by fear and stigma and lack of understanding and inequity.
I'm just wondering about this concept of airmanship. Do you have any sense of how that happens? Like, for example, with flying, is it the case that one day you can't fly, and then the next day you can't fly, and then the next day you can't fly, and you don't know what you're doing, and then you don't know what you're doing, and then you just like wake up one day and something clicks, and then you can? Like a sigmoidal shape? Or do you feel like it's more gradual, where the gut instinct develops incrementally over time? I'm just interested in almost like the kinetics of how people develop airmanship.
Well, I think it is both nonlinear and highly variable between people. Like, one of the hardest things for me was that I was really bad at it. And genuinely, I was watching a lot of people do what looked like sigmoidal curves. And I felt as though mine was linear, if linear. But I don't think it's easy to quantify like that. But I'd say that it's highly variable. And different parts may come at different times. I don't think I was particularly fast at learning medicine either, actually, as a med student or even as an intern. There were certainly long periods where I thought, oh God, it's linear and it's almost flat.
And I was thinking, too, about how sometimes we toggle in and out of that state of airmanship or gut feeling or flow. And it reminded me of this scene from Star Wars, where Luke Skywalker is flying the plane and he's aligning all of the technical equipment and the target and pressing all the buttons. And you can see that he's like so in his head. And you can see that he's kind of flustered and overwhelmed. And then you hear this voice. And I think it might be Obi-Wan Kenobi. And it's like, Luke, use the Force. And then he I don't know if he turns off the equipment or if he just looks away from it. And it's this moment of just letting go and slipping into his intuition. And then he's able to use that to guide himself right into his target. And then he's successful and things like that. And so I And I've noticed this with me, maybe less in medicine, but more in other types of tasks, like creative tasks, like writing. Sometimes you sit down to write and you're just like in your head and it's not flowing. And then there are other times where you get into a flow state and it almost feels like you're just channeling, like it's not even coming from you. Does any of this ring true around this idea of airmanship?
I think it brings up a couple things to me, and one of them is that I get really worried and a little suspicious when doctors say that they're going to make a decision because, quote, it feels right to them. Because to me, the idea of airmanship is you get to the conclusion in a way that you may not understand at the time, like recognizing a syndrome or becoming worried about a developing clinical situation. But then to me, in order to make sense of that, you should be able to go back and say, actually, these are why these things are coming up to me. It shouldn't be that you make decisions purely based on the force. But I do think it's a pro tip, don't use the force to do medicine. As a sidebar, I think Hollywood is fascinated with the idea of flow as it relates to all kinds of things like flying or rock climbing, which is my other fun thing. But then in medicine or anything that's rigorous or like science, you need to be able to go back and say, actually, here's why I think X, Y, and Z. So you need to be able to combine the intuition with a lot of facts backing it up.
You mentioned rock climbing, and so we know that you are a pilot. Now we know that you are a rock climber. And then when you arrived at the studio, I was joking with you about the pictures I saw of you summiting a mountain. And gosh, that mountain was so tall, it looked like you were in space. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your penchant for adventure. Where did it come from? Why do you love doing all of these exhilarating activities?
Well, I'll start by saying that I'm really not good at any of them. I don't fly anymore because it is something that's really not affordable in the States. It's much cheaper in England for sort of complex historical reasons. But I do love rock climbing and I do love mountaineering. Actually, I was never athletic as a kid. And then when I was living in England, my neighbor found me climbing a tree and asked if anyone had ever taught me to do it properly. So that's how I ended up rock climbing. The mountaineering kind of came out of that. And I think what it is that it's just a wonderful sense of freedom. And it is a wonderful way to understand other people and to get to know people really well. Because after you've climbed a mountain with someone, you really, really, really know them. I think a good medicine metaphor is like spending a 28-hour shift with someone. You're not going to see them at their best. You're going to see how they make decisions under pressure. You're going to see what they do when they're afraid. You're going to see them without any sort of artifice because there is nothing you can maintain, whether it's makeup or a coherent speech necessarily over 28 hours. And if you still like and respect each other after that, then you really, really love them.
Because a lot of these mountain climbs, you'll have to forgive me for not knowing the jargon. I'm like, the mountain climbs, they're dangerous, right? Talk to us about the reality of what could go wrong. And I imagine that's also similar to medicine, like really thinking ahead and troubleshooting and managing risk and things like that.
Yeah, so I would argue that the way that I do this is not particularly risky. I think climbing has had a lot of press recently, especially with Free Solo as a movie, where it looks like this sort of daredevil, free-spirited, slightly crazy feat. I don't do any of that. What I do is, I think, relatively fairly tame. I usually go climbing at well-established crags, or I go up mountains, which are mostly hiking with a bit of ice involved. Which is not to say that there is zero risk. And I think one thing that a lot of my climbing medicine friends felt around the pandemic was that for the first time, the perception of personal risk had come into our work lives. But it was something that we were used to navigating in this other part of our lives, which had suddenly and unwantedly come into work. But I would say that I really don't think I'm an adrenaline junkie. I'm sure my parents would disagree.
It's funny that you say that about adrenaline junkie, because I almost was going to ask why ID and why not emergency medicine or critical care medicine or these specialties that we stereotypically associate with adrenaline junkies. How did you land in infectious disease?
I love both of those fields. I think ER is not longitudinal enough for me. I mean, it's super fun. I loved rotating in the emergency room, especially at the general, but that doesn't fit me. Critical care I very much considered. I think that infectious disease is very central to trying to recognize the inequities in medicine, both in this country and globally. And also the ways that medicine is changing as our world is changing are very tied up in infectious disease. I think the terrifying challenges of our time do include pandemics and do include things that affect them, like climate change, like biodiversity decreases. A lot of the ways that I think medicine is fundamentally going to change have to do with infectious disease.
You mentioned health, medicine, and climate. Obviously, these are intimately connected. And I'm wondering, as somebody who spends so much time in the outdoors and connecting to nature and connecting to the earth, if that has affected at all your understanding of how medicine and health interacts with the environment. I'm a city person. Obviously, I understand the concept of we all share air, we all share water, but do you find yourself having any unique insights on that topic, having all of these hobbies in the outdoors?
I think it just makes it very visceral. So there's Mount Shasta in the north of California, which is a very special mountain to me because it's connected to how I met my partner, actually. We did it last year. We did it this year. And this year, there's no snow on it. So we did it in May, and we had to do it via a rock route, which is fine. That's fun, too. But there shouldn't be no snow on it in May. It's just very obvious. And then in 2020, I think the hardest part for me, just personally speaking, was when both the pandemic and the fires were really bad in California, because it just felt as though I couldn't be inside and I couldn't be outside and there was just nowhere I could be. I found dealing with the fires like just quite psychologically hard.
You mentioned this story of how you weren't very athletic growing up, but then in England one day, your neighbor found you climbing a tree and asked you, do you know how to climb a tree properly? So can you tell us that story? What does it mean to climb a tree properly?
Oh, that was really funny. I mean, I'll start by saying my dad is reasonably outdoorsy and hikes, but my mom is from New York and grew up in Manhattan. So I grew up hiking, but I didn't know how to camp. I didn't know how to go to the bathroom without like a bathroom. Really basic stuff. And then I was living in Oxford and literally just climbing a tree. And my neighbor, who was this fantastic Welsh scientist, was just like, hey, I climb. Have you ever learned how to do this for real? And I was like, no, what? And I was 18 or 19. And so he started taking me to the climbing gym. And I was like, this is wonderful. I'm so enjoying it. And then I started running to cross-train, and then gradually I got more and more into it. And then I moved back to the States and met some really lovely people who took me under their wing and taught me to climb. And then in med school, my classmates happened to be good trad climbers, and so they taught me how to trad climb.
What is trad climb?
Oh, it's a different style, which involves different gear. It's very cool. And then I started dating my partner, who's much more of a mountain person, so I started learning a bit of mountaineering. But the fun thing is there's so much to learn. My new thing is that I really, really want to get anywhere decent at skiing, because I really don't know how to ski. And so my big project for the next couple of years is to try to learn how to ski, because I'd really love to backcountry ski more.
You mentioned how flying in the United States is difficult for a variety of reasons, including cost. But I'm wondering, if you hopped on a plane to England tomorrow, could you get in an airplane and fly? Is it like riding a bike? Or would you have to start from the beginning of the curve? Or what would that be like?
You know, it's funny because every time I go back to England, which hasn't been recently because of the pandemic, obviously, I do try to go flying because I have a few very good friends in England and all of them fly. And one of them had her wedding when I was an intern. And at the wedding, they actually had a flying display. It was ridiculously cool. But no, I would say that you certainly are not starting from the beginning. You know how it should feel, even if you can't make it happen. But I wouldn't necessarily trust me to manage a flight takeoff to landing because it has been a hot minute. I think the cool thing about doing these things is that you're always surrounded by people who are much better than you at them. And so it's incredibly humbling because I'm probably a good rock climber compared to you. I'll take that liberty. But I'm
Definitely.
But compared to the people I know, I'm really not that good. And I'm so honored to know so many doctors who are so good at what they do, in and out of infectious disease, that I could never characterize myself as particularly good at it because I've got such wonderful examples around me.
Yeah, and I love how you say that with a smile on your face and with a positive and optimistic outlook, because I think sometimes when we come into medicine and we find ourselves surrounded by extraordinary peers and extraordinary mentors, it can be a fuel for feeling shame or feeling inadequate or feeling imposter syndrome or I don't belong here or any number of thoughts like that. But I just love hearing you talk about this and hearing the audience can't see your face, but you're like glowing as you talk about this and how you really see these examples as sources of inspiration and how that humility comes through in a positive way.
Yeah, I don't think that that's universal. And I think that there are plenty of places where you're made to feel small if you don't know as much or don't fit into everyone's idea of what a doctor is or should be or should look like in any dimension. But I think if you're in a place which validates being new and learning, then it is genuinely joyful to say, well, there are these fabulous people around and I have so much to learn. And that part of the learning curve is so fun to me.
And in a way, that's what your story was about in the end. That's why there's two of us in the cockpit. Like, you're not alone. We're here as a team. So do you think medicine has that collaborative environment that is pro-learning, or do you feel like we have some work to do around normalizing not knowing, failure? Where do you think we are with that as a medical culture?
Ooh, there are so many ways to answer this wrong. I think that more work needed. Still a long way to go in a lot of parts of medicine. I don't want to sound ridiculously optimistic or Pollyanna-ish. I think medicine has a history of being horrifically discriminatory and stigmatizing to people who were newer or younger or any other way that we didn't perceive the role of doctor. And I certainly don't want to make light of that. But I'm really hopeful that we're getting better. And I really love the team that I work with now. And I am really hopeful about the future of medicine and perhaps the way that I'll live within it.
As we wrap up, my last question is around your path as an infectious disease doctor. What is next for you? What do you spend your time thinking about? You mentioned that you're a scientist. What are you interested in learning about, researching? What are the big questions that you're turning around in your mind these days?
I think the big scientific questions are what's going on with how we get so sick from a respiratory perspective, both COVID and non-COVID. Why does that happen? And what can we do about it? Those are obviously huge questions. And I think I need to find bits of them that are amenable to me sort of chipping in my tiny little way at them and taking what I learned clinically and building that in. And then there are the other big questions like, how do you pick backcountry skis and how does one start learning that? And that's another big question that I'm also dealing with.
Well, it's been so much fun to chat with you today, Natasha, about your story and about all of the exciting things that you're doing, both inside and outside the hospital. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience before we end?
I think we lose the habit of being okay with being bad at things as we get older. Especially a lot of work cultures are not forgiving of newness and failure. But I think continuing to try new things and to be willing to be bad at them is the closest I have seen to a gift. It's a gift to keep getting to do things, to be bad at them, to learn. And it just brings me so much joy. I would encourage listeners to keep doing that.
The joy of failure.
Yeah.
This is a phrase that I've been thinking about a lot as well, as somebody who can definitely tip into the perfectionism category is the joy of failure. How do we tap into that? And so I think that's a great place to leave off. Thank you so much, Natasha, for coming in today and for sharing your story on the Nocturnist stage.
Thank you so much.
This episode of The Nocturnist was produced, edited, and mixed by John Oliver. Natasha's story was coached by me and Adelaide Papazzolo and performed live at The Nocturnist in San Francisco in January 2020. Our executive producer is Ali Block, our chief operating officer is Rebecca Groves, our communications and social media intern is Yuki Schwab, and our medical student fellow is Snehal Murthy. Original theme music was composed by Yosef Monroe, and additional music comes from Blue Dot Sessions. Illustrations for this season of The Nocturnist are by Ashley Florial. The Nocturnists is made possible by the California Medical Association, a physician-led organization that works tirelessly to make sure that the doctor-patient relationship remains at the center of medicine. To learn more about the CMA, visit cmadocs.org. The Nocturnist is also supported by the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation and by donations from listeners like you. Thank you so much for supporting our work in storytelling. If you enjoy the show, please help others find us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. To contribute your voice to one of our upcoming projects or to make a donation, visit our website at thenocturnists.com. I'm your host, Emily Silverman. See you next time.